water was crystal clear, the sunlight cutting through the waves when the first shadow appeared beneath the surface. Before there was time to react, a sudden jolt sent shockwaves through the body, blood blooming like ink in the sea. The world became a blur of thrashing limbs and razor-sharp teeth. The silence of the ocean was replaced by the deafening roar of survival. It was then, in that chaos, that the true horror of the predator revealed itself. Hello everyone, welcome to the channel. Before we start with today's shark attack story, I want to ask for your support by subscribing to the channel. Your subscription is very important to us, so please subscribe and leave a comment letting me know where in the world you are watching from. Click the like button, and let's get into the story. Sophie Dubois stepped off the plane at Cairns Airport, her heart racing with excitement. The humid air hit her like a wall as she made her way through the terminal, pulling her small suitcase behind her. At 30 years old, this was her first solo trip outside of Europe, and the culmination of years of dreaming about the Great Barrier Reef. As she waited for her taxi, Sophie's eyes were drawn to a large poster showcasing the vibrant underwater world she'd soon explore. Schools of colorful fish darted around intricate coral formations, and a sea turtle glided gracefully through crystal-clear waters. She couldn't help but smile, imagining herself floating among such beauty. The taxi ride to her beachfront resort was a blur of lush tropical vegetation and glimpses of the sparkling coral sea. Sophie's driver, a friendly local named Dave, filled the journey with stories of the area. "First time in Cairns, love?" Dave asked, glancing at Sophie in the rearview mirror. "Oui, I mean yes," Sophie replied, her French accent evident. "I've dreamed of seeing the Great Barrier Reef for so long. It's almost hard to believe I'm finally here." Dave chuckled. "Well, you've picked a beaut of a time to visit. The weather's perfect for snorkeling. Just remember to listen to your guides and stay in the designated areas. The reef's a wonder, but it can be dangerous if you're not careful." Sophie nodded, only half listening as she gazed out the window at the passing scenery. The concept of danger seemed so distant in this paradise. As they pulled up to the resort, Sophie gasped. The building was a low-rise structure that seemed to blend seamlessly with the surrounding palm trees and tropical flowers. Beyond it, she could see a strip of golden sand and the endless expanse of the coral sea, its waters shifting from turquoise near the shore to a deep, mesmerizing blue on the horizon. "Here we are, miss," Dave said, helping Sophie with her luggage. "Enjoy your stay, and remember what I said about being careful out there." Sophie thanked him and made her way to the reception, her eyes constantly drawn to the breathtaking view. The resort's open-air lobby was filled with the sound of gently flowing water from a decorative fountain and the sweet scent of frangipani flowers. "Welcome to Coral Cove Resort, Ms. Dubois." The receptionist greeted her with a warm smile. "We hope you'll enjoy your stay with us. Your room is on the second floor with a lovely view of the ocean." As Sophie followed the porter to her room, she couldn't help but feel a surge of pure joy. This was everything she had imagined and more. The room itself was spacious and airy, with large windows that opened onto a private balcony overlooking the sea. After freshening up, Sophie decided to explore the resort. She changed into a light sundress and sandals, grabbed her sun hat, and headed down to the beach. The sand was warm beneath her feet, and the gentle lapping of waves against the shore created a soothing rhythm. As she walked along the water's edge, letting the cool waves wash over her toes, Sophie noticed a small group of people gathered near a bulletin board. Curiosity piqued. She wandered over to see what had caught their attention. The board was covered with colorful flyers advertising various reef tours and activities. But what drew Sophie's eye was a slightly worn notice in the corner. It was a warning about increased shark activity in certain areas of the reef. Sophie's French was much stronger than her English, and she struggled to understand some of the more technical terms. But the image of a shark's silhouette was clear enough. A voice beside her made her jump. Thinking of going out on the reef, Sophie turned to see a young woman with sun-bleached hair and a friendly smile. "Oh yes," Sophie replied. "I'm going snorkeling tomorrow. I can't wait to see the fish and the corals." The woman nodded. "It's amazing out there. I'm Emma, by the way. I work as a marine biologist here." "Sophie," she introduced herself. "I'm from Paris. This is my first time in Australia." Emma's eyes lit up. Oh, you're in for a treat then. The reef is like nothing else on Earth. Just make sure you go with a good tour group and listen to your guides. The ocean demands respect, you know? Sophie nodded, her eyes drifting back to the shark notice. Emma followed her gaze and chuckled. Don't worry too much about that. Shark attacks are incredibly rare. They're actually quite shy creatures most of the time. But it's always good to be aware and stay in the areas the guides recommend. Despite Emma's reassurances, Sophie felt a small knot of anxiety form in her stomach. She'd never considered the potential dangers lurking beneath those beautiful waters. But surely the tour operators knew what they were doing, right? As the sun began to set, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and pink, Sophie made her way back to the resort. She decided to have dinner at the beachfront restaurant, where she found herself seated next to a boisterous group of American tourists. "Hey there!" One of them, a friendly-looking man in his 40s, called out to her. "You look like you could use some company. Want to join us?" Sophie hesitated for a moment, then smiled and nodded. "Thank you. That would be nice." As she pulled her chair over to their table, the man introduced himself as Mike and quickly presented the rest of the group: his wife, Linda, their friends Tom and Sarah, and Tom and Sarah's teenage children, Josh and Emily. "So where are you from?" Linda asked as they perused the menus. "I'm from Paris," Sophie replied. "This is my first time in Australia." "Oh, how exciting," Sarah exclaimed. "We're from California, but we've been planning this trip for ages. The kids are so excited about snorkeling on the reef tomorrow." Sophie's eyes lit up. "Really? I'm going snorkeling tomorrow too. Perhaps we're on the same tour." They compared notes and discovered they were indeed booked on the same excursion. Sophie felt a wave of relief wash over her. The idea of facing the vast ocean alongside these friendly faces made her feel much more at ease. As they chatted and enjoyed their meals, Sophie found herself swept up in the group's enthusiasm. They shared stories of past adventures and their hopes for this trip. The earlier anxiety about sharks and ocean dangers faded to the back of her mind, replaced by excitement for the day to come. After dinner, pleasantly full and slightly tipsy from the excellent Australian wine, Sophie bid goodnight to her new friends and made her way back to her room. She stepped out onto the balcony, breathing in the salt-tinged air and listening to the rhythmic sound of the waves. The moon hung low and full over the water, casting a silvery path across the sea. In the distance, Sophie could make out the lights of a boat moving slowly along the horizon. She imagined it full of divers exploring the wonders of the reef by night. As she prepared for bed, Sophie's mind was filled with images of the underwater world she would soon explore. She fell asleep to dreams of gliding effortlessly through clear blue waters, surrounded by schools of colorful fish and intricate coral formations. But as the night wore on, her dreams took a darker turn. The vibrant reef faded to a murky gray, and the playful fish were replaced by darker, more ominous shapes. Sophie tossed and turned, her subconscious grappling with the mixture of excitement and fear that lay just beneath the surface of her waking mind. In her dream, she found herself alone in deep, dark water. Something brushed against her leg, and as she spun around in panic, she caught a glimpse of a large, sleek shape gliding past. A fin broke the surface nearby, and Sophie tried to scream, but no sound came out. She awoke with a start, her heart pounding. The room was dark, but through the open balcony doors she could hear the gentle sound of the waves. Sophie took a deep breath, trying to shake off the lingering unease from her nightmare. "It was just a dream," she whispered to herself in French, running a hand through her tangled hair. Just a silly dream. She got up and walked to the balcony, hoping the fresh air would clear her head. The night was still and calm, the sea a vast dark expanse under the starry sky. As she stood there, letting the cool breeze wash over her, Sophie tried to recapture the excitement she'd felt earlier. Tomorrow, she would see the Great Barrier Reef with her own eyes. It would be magical, she told herself firmly. There was nothing to be afraid of. She was just letting her imagination run wild. With a final look at the moonlit ocean, Sophie returned to bed. As she drifted off to sleep again, she focused on the happy images from earlier. The colorful fish, the intricate corals, the new friends she'd made. But somewhere in the back of her mind, a small voice whispered a warning. The ocean, beautiful as it was, held secrets, and dangers, and Sophie, in her eagerness to explore its wonders, was oblivious to the true nature of the adventure that awaited her beneath the waves. The morning sun had barely peeked over the horizon when Sophie's alarm jolted her awake. For a moment she lay disoriented, the unfamiliar sounds of distant waves and tropical birds filtering through her open balcony doors. Then, with a rush of excitement, she remembered. Today was the day she would finally explore the Great Barrier Reef. Sophie sprang out of bed, her earlier nightmares forgotten in the face of the adventure ahead. She dressed quickly in her swimsuit, pulling a light sundress over it and packing a small waterproof bag with essentials, sunscreen, a towel, and her underwater camera. As she made her way down to the resort's lobby, her stomach fluttered with a mixture of anticipation and nerves. The reception area was already buzzing with activity, other early risers preparing for their own excursions. "Bonjour, Sophie," a cheerful voice called out. She turned to see Mike and Linda from the previous night's dinner, waving her over. "Ready for the big adventure?" Sophie smiled, grateful for the familiar faces. Yes, I could hardly sleep, I was so excited." Linda laughed, linking her arm through Sophie's as they walked towards the waiting minibus. "I know exactly what you mean. I kept waking up, worried we'd oversleep and miss the boat." The drive to the marina was short but filled with chatter as the group from last night reconnected. Sophie found herself seated next to Josh, the teenager she'd met at dinner. "First time snorkeling?" he asked, noticing her fingers nervously tapping against her leg. Sophie nodded. "Is it that obvious?" Josh grinned. "A little, but don't worry, it's easy. Just remember to breathe through your mouth, not your nose, and you'll be fine." As they arrived at the marina, Sophie's breath caught in her throat. Dozens of boats were moored in the clear turquoise water, from small fishing vessels to larger tourist catamarans. Their guide, a sun-weathered man introduced as Captain Steve, ushered them onto a sleek, white boat named Reef Explorer. "All right, folks," Captain Steve called out as they settled onto the boat's cushioned seats. "We've got about an hour's ride out to our first snorkel spot. Please listen carefully to the safety briefing." As the boat pulled away from the dock, a young woman with a clipboard stepped forward. "G'day, everyone. I'm Zoe, and I'll be one of your snorkel guides today. Before we get to the fun stuff, we need to go over some important safety information." Sophie listened intently as Zoe explained how to use the snorkel gear, what to do in case of emergency, and the importance of not touching or standing on the coral. However, as Zoe moved on to discussing the marine life they might encounter, Sophie found her attention wandering, captivated by the changing scenery as they moved further from shore. The coastline receded, becoming a distant green-fringed line on the horizon. The water deepened from turquoise to a rich, mesmerizing blue. Occasionally, flying fish would break the surface, skimming across the waves before disappearing back into the depths. "And remember," Zoe's voice cut through Sophie's reverie, "it's crucial that you stay within the designated snorkel area. We've chosen spots that are safe and offer the best viewing, but if you drift too far, you could encounter stronger currents or less friendly wildlife." A chill ran down Sophie's spine as she remembered the shark notice from yesterday. She raised her hand tentatively. "Excusez-moi, what about sharks? Are they common in the area?" A ripple of nervous laughter went through the group. Zoe smiled reassuringly. "Shark encounters are extremely rare, especially in the areas where we snorkel. They generally avoid humans. That said, we always keep a lookout. And if we spot any large marine life, we'll call everyone back to the boat immediately." Sophie nodded, not entirely comforted. As the safety briefing concluded and the passengers broke into excited chatter, she found herself gazing out at the vast expanse of ocean, its beauty now tinged with a hint of apprehension. Before long, Captain Steve's voice boomed over the speaker system. "Ladies and gentlemen, we've arrived at our first snorkel spot. If you look over the side, you'll start to see the coral formations. We call this area the Gardens because of the variety of coral you'll see." Sophie joined the others at the railing, gasping as she peered into the crystal-clear water. Just below the surface, a wonderland of colors and shapes spread out as far as she could see. Delicate branching corals swayed gently in the current, while robust brain corals formed intricate mazes. Fish of every hue darted in and out of the coral formations. "It's like another world," she breathed, her earlier fears momentarily forgotten in the face of such beauty. "All right, folks," Zoe called out. "We'll gear up and enter the water in small groups. Remember, stay close to your buddy and within sight of the boat or a guide at all times." Sophie fumbled with her mask and fins, her hands shaking slightly with excitement and nerves. Linda, noticing her struggle, came over to help. "Here, let me show you a trick," Linda said, applying a small amount of defogger to the inside of Sophie's mask. "This will keep it from fogging up underwater. Just remember to breathe slowly and relax. The calmer you are, the more you'll enjoy it." Sophie nodded gratefully. "Merci, thank you. I'm a bit nervous, but also so excited." "You'll do great," Linda assured her. "Stick close to Mike and me if you want. We've done this a few times." As their group prepared to enter the water, Sophie took a deep breath, steeling herself. The anticipation that had been building for months was about to become reality. She watched as Mike and Linda gracefully slipped into the water, followed by Tom and Sarah. Josh and Emily were already in, playfully splashing each other as they adjusted their snorkels. "Ready?" Zoe asked, appearing at Sophie's elbow. Sophie nodded, her throat suddenly dry. With Zoe's gentle guidance, she sat on the edge of the boat, her feet dangling in the warm water. "Whenever you're ready, just slide in and put your face in the water. I'll be right beside you," Zoe assured her. Taking one last deep breath, Sophie pushed off from the boat. The water enveloped her in a warm embrace, and for a moment, all she could hear was the thundering of her own heartbeat. Then, gathering her courage, she put her face in the water and looked down. The world exploded into color and movement. Schools of tiny, iridescent fish swirled around her, parting like a living curtain. Just below, the coral garden sprawled in all its glory, more vibrant and alive than any photo could ever capture. Sophie gasped in wonder, forgetting for a moment that she was supposed to breathe through her mouth. She came up spluttering, but laughing with sheer joy. "Amazing, isn't it?" Zoe said, steadying her. "Take your time, get comfortable. When you're ready, we'll swim over to that large coral formation. That's where we often see sea turtles." Nodding eagerly, Sophie adjusted her snorkel and dipped her face back into the water. This time she remembered to breathe slowly and steadily through her mouth. As she grew more confident, she began to swim, marveling at how the slightest movement of her fins propelled her effortlessly through the water. She followed Zoe towards the coral formation, her eyes darting everywhere, trying to take in every detail. A clownfish peeked out from its anemone home, its orange and white stripes vivid against the swaying tentacles. A blue-spotted stingray glided gracefully over the sandy bottom, stirring up small clouds of sediment. As they neared the large coral formation, Zoe gestured excitedly. Sophie looked in the direction she was pointing and her heart leaped. A green sea turtle was gracefully making its way along the reef, pausing occasionally to munch on some seagrass. Sophie was so entranced by the turtle that she didn't notice she had drifted slightly away from the group. The current, gentle but persistent, was slowly carrying her towards the edge of the designated snorkel area. It wasn't until she looked up to locate the boat that she realized how far she'd gone. A flutter of panic rose in her chest as she saw the distance between herself and the others. She turned to swim back, but the current seemed stronger now, pushing against her. Her breathing quickened, becoming ragged and panicked. "Calm down," she told herself sternly, forcing herself to take slow, deep breaths. "Just swim steadily. You can do this." As she struggled against the current, movement in her peripheral vision caught her attention. She turned her head sharply, heart pounding. For a moment she thought she saw a large dark shape moving in the deeper water beyond the reef. But when she looked directly, there was nothing there. Shaken, Sophie redoubled her efforts to reach the group. She could see Zoe swimming towards her now, a look of concern on her face. "Are you all right?" Zoe asked as she reached Sophie. "You drifted quite far." Sophie nodded, still breathing heavily. "I'm okay. I thought I saw something. In the deep water." Zoe's expression turned serious. "What kind of something?" "I'm not sure," Sophie admitted. "Just a shape. It was probably nothing. My imagination, maybe?" Zoe nodded, but her eyes scanned the water carefully. "Let's head back to the group. Remember, Stay close and keep an eye on your surroundings. As they swam back, Sophie couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that had come over her. The vibrant underwater world suddenly seemed less welcoming, the deep blue beyond the reef holding unknown dangers. Back with the group, Linda swam up to her. "Everything okay? We were worried when we couldn't see you." Sophie forced a smile. "Yes, I'm fine. Just got a bit carried away following a turtle." As the snorkel session continued, Sophie tried to recapture her earlier wonder and excitement. The reef was still breathtakingly beautiful, teeming with life and color. But now she couldn't help glancing occasionally towards the deeper water, half expecting to see that dark shape again. When Captain Steve's voice came over the underwater speaker, calling them back to the boat, Sophie felt a mixture of disappointment and relief. As amazing as the experience had been, part of her would be glad to be back on solid ground. As she climbed the ladder back onto the boat, legs shaky from the prolonged time in the water, Sophie took one last look at the vast blue expanse behind her. The ocean, she realized, was not just a place of beauty and wonder, but one of mystery and potential danger. And somewhere out there, unseen but ever present, the creatures of the deep went about their lives, indifferent to the awe and fear they inspired in the humans who ventured into their world. As the boat moved towards their second snorkeling spot, Sophie sat quietly, lost in thought. The exhilaration of her first underwater experience was tempered by the unsettling moment when she drifted away from the group. She couldn't shake the memory of that dark shape she thought she'd seen in the deeper water. "Hey, you okay?" Josh's voice broke through her reverie. The teenager plopped down next to her, his hair still dripping from the previous swim. Sophie managed to smile. "Yes, I'm fine. Just processing everything, I suppose." Josh nodded knowingly. "It's pretty overwhelming at first, right? All that life, the colors. It's like being on another planet." "Exactment," Sophie agreed. "It's beautiful, but also a little frightening?" Josh's eyes widened with interest. "Frightening? Did you see something cool? A shark, maybe?" Sophie hesitated, unsure whether to share her experience. Before she could decide, Captain Steve's voice boomed over the speakers. "All right, folks, we're approaching our second location. This spot is known as the Drop-Off. It's a bit deeper than our last stop, with a steep coral wall that attracts all sorts of marine life." As the passengers gathered their gear, Zoe began another briefing. "The Drop-Off is a fantastic spot, but it requires extra caution. The current can be a bit stronger here, so it's crucial that you stay within the designated area. We'll have a guide at each end of the swim zone to make sure no one drifts too far." Sophie felt a knot form in her stomach. The idea of stronger currents made her nervous after her earlier experience. She glanced at Linda, who gave her an encouraging smile. "You'll be fine, honey," Linda assured her. "Just stick close to us if you're worried." As they prepared to enter the water, Sophie noticed Zoe and Captain Steve in a hushed conversation, occasionally glancing her way. Had Zoe told the captain about her drifting earlier, or about the shape she thought she'd seen? "Ready to go, Sophie?" Zoe asked, approaching her with a reassuring smile. "I'll be keeping a close eye on everyone this time. Don't hesitate to signal if you need anything, okay?" Sophie nodded, grateful for the extra attention. As she slipped into the water, the initial shock of submersion gave way to wonder once again. The Drop-Off was aptly named. The coral reef seemed to plummet into an abyss of deep blue. Schools of fish swirled in tight formations, their scales glinting in the filtered sunlight. Despite her earlier apprehension, Sophie found herself captivated. She followed Linda and Mike along the edge of the Drop-Off, marveling at the sheer diversity of marine life. Parrotfish nibbled at the coral, their beaks making an audible crunching sound underwater. A moray eel peered out from its rocky hideaway, its sinuous body partially hidden in the shadows. As they swam, Sophie began to relax, falling into a rhythm of slow, steady breaths through her snorkel. The underwater world had a meditative quality, the gentle swaying of the coral and the mesmerizing movements of the fish creating a sense of peace. Then, something caught her eye, a flash of silver in the deep blue beyond the reef. Sophie paused, treading water as she peered into the depths. There it was again, a large, sleek shape moving with fluid grace far below them. Her heart began to race. Was this the same shape she'd glimpsed earlier? It was too far away to make out clearly, but something about its movement, its size, sent a chill through her. Sophie looked around, realizing she'd stopped while the others had swum ahead. She was about to swim after them when movement in her peripheral vision made her turn sharply. The shape was closer now, ascending slowly from the depths. As it neared, features became discernible: a pointed snout, a powerful tail, unmistakable fins. A shark. Terror gripped Sophie, her breath coming in short, sharp gasps through the snorkel. The rational part of her brain tried to recall Zoe's assurances about shark behavior, but panic was quickly taking over. The shark continued its ascent, not directly towards her but parallel to the reef wall. It was a reef shark, Sophie realized, probably about 2 meters long. Despite her fear, she couldn't help but admire its sleek beauty, the way it moved so effortlessly through the water. Sophie remained frozen in place, afraid that any movement might attract the shark's attention. She watched as it glided past, its black eyes seeming to reflect nothing. For a moment, she thought it would continue on its way, uninterested in the strange, floundering creature at the surface. Then, almost lazily, the shark turned. It began to circle, its path bringing it gradually closer to where Sophie floated. Panic surged through her. She needed to get back to the boat, back to the group, but her limbs felt leaden with fear. The shark completed another circle, closer still. Sophie could see the texture of its skin now, the slight movement of its gills as it passed. In desperation, she began to swim, not toward the group but back towards the boat. Her strokes were clumsy, splashing noisily at the surface. She knew she was doing everything wrong, making noise, thrashing about like wounded prey. But terror had overridden all rational thought. "Help!" She tried to shout, but the snorkel muffled her cries. She spat it out, gasping, "Oh, secours! Help me!" On the boat, Captain Steve was the first to hear her cries. He grabbed a pair of binoculars, quickly spotting Sophie's flailing form. "Zoe," he shouted into his radio. "We've got a swimmer in distress, northeast quadrant, possible marine life encounter." In the water, Zoe's head snapped up at the captain's call. She spotted Sophie and immediately began swimming towards her, gesturing for the other guides to get the rest of the group back to the boat. Sophie was aware of the commotion her cries had caused, but her focus remained on the shark. It was still circling, but its movements had become more erratic, agitated by her splashing. In her panic, Sophie failed to notice how close she'd come to the reef. Her leg brushed against the rough coral, leaving a long, shallow scrape. The metallic scent of blood diffused through the water. The shark's circles tightened. "Sophie!" Zoe's voice cut through her panic. The guide was approaching rapidly, a yellow rescue buoy in tow. "Sophie, I need you to calm down. Slow, easy movements. I'm coming to you." Sophie tried to steady her breathing, to move more smoothly through the water, but every time she caught sight of the shark's fin breaking the surface, a fresh wave of panic washed over her. Zoe reached her, wrapping an arm around her waist. "I've got you," she assured Sophie. "We're going to slowly make our way back to the boat. Nice and easy, okay?" Sophie nodded, clinging to Zoe. As they began to swim, she risked a glance back. The shark was still there, following at a distance. Its behavior had changed. It no longer seemed merely curious but intent. "Zoe," Sophie gasped. "The shark, it's following us." Zoe glanced back, her expression grim. "It's okay. We're almost there. Captain Steve will start the engines. That should scare it off." As if on cue, the boat's engines roared to life. The sudden noise startled Sophie, causing her to jerk in Zoe's grasp. Her leg, already scraped from the coral, cramped painfully. "Ay!" she cried out, instinctively kicking out against the pain. Her foot connected with something solid, something that felt terrifyingly alive. Time seemed to slow. Sophie felt something brush past her leg, rough like sandpaper. She looked down just in time to see the shark's powerful tail propel it forward, its mouth opening to reveal rows of serrated teeth. "Zoe!" Sophie screamed, but her voice was lost as she was pulled underwater. The world became a chaos of bubbles and thrashing limbs. Sophie felt a searing pain in her calf as the shark's teeth grazed her. She kicked out blindly, her foot connecting with the shark's sensitive snout. Surprised, it released her, Sophie broke the surface, gasping and choking. Zoe was there in an instant, dragging her towards the boat where Captain Steve and Mike were leaning out, arms extended. "Pull her up," Zoe shouted. "Quick!" Hands grasped Sophie's arms, hauling her over the side of the boat. She collapsed on the deck, coughing and shaking uncontrollably. Linda was at her side immediately, wrapping her in a towel. "The shark," Sophie managed between gasps. It's gone," Captain Steve assured her, his voice gruff with concern. "Probably spooked by the engines and all the commotion." As the adrenaline began to ebb, the pain in Sophie's leg made itself known. She looked down to see a series of shallow cuts along her calf, blood seeping slowly from the wounds. "Let me take a look at that," Zoe said, kneeling beside her with a first aid kit. As she cleaned and bandaged the wound, she spoke softly to Sophie. "You're okay. The cuts are superficial. Shark was probably just as scared as you were." Sophie nodded numbly, the reality of what had just happened slowly sinking in. She'd come face to face with one of the ocean's apex predators and survived. The beauty of the reef now seemed distant, overshadowed by the primal fear she'd experienced. As the boat began its journey back to shore, Sophie huddled under her towel, replaying the encounter in her mind. The grace of the shark's movement, the terror of its approach, the texture of its skin as it brushed past her. Every detail was seared into her memory. She was vaguely aware of the concerned voices around her, of Linda's comforting arm across her shoulders. But Sophie's mind was still in the water, still seeing that dark shape emerging from the depths. She had come to the Great Barrier Reef seeking wonder and beauty. She had found it, yes, but she had also discovered the raw, untamed power of nature, a force that would haunt her dreams for years to come. As the shore came into view, Sophie finally spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "I saw the shadow beneath the surface, and in that moment, I understood. We are but visitors in their world, tolerated, but never truly welcome." The others exchanged worried glances but remained silent. They knew that Sophie's encounter had changed her, had stripped away the illusion of safety that most tourists cling to. She had glimpsed the true face of the ocean, beautiful, terrifying, and utterly indifferent to human presence. The shadows below had revealed themselves, and Sophie would never look at the sea the same way again. The boat cut through the waves, its engine a dull roar that matched the pounding in Sophie's ears. Her body shook uncontrollably, a mix of adrenaline crash and shock setting in. The concerned faces of her fellow tourists swam in and out of focus as she struggled to process what had just happened. "Sophie, Sophie, can you hear me?" Linda's voice pierced through the fog in her mind. The older woman was kneeling beside her, a weathered hand gently squeezing her shoulder. Sophie nodded weakly, her throat too tight to form words. She looked down at her leg, where Zoe had bandaged the shark's grazing bite. The white gauze was already tinged with pink, a stark reminder of how close she'd come to a more serious injury. Captain Steve's gruff voice carried over the engine noise. "We're radioing ahead for medical assistance. They'll meet us at the marina." The word medical snapped Sophie back to reality. No, I don't need..." She started to protest, but her voice cracked, and she dissolved into tears. Linda wrapped her arms around Sophie, holding her as she sobbed. "It's okay, honey. Let it out. You're safe now." As Sophie's sobs subsided into hiccups, she became aware of the low murmur of voices around her. The other tourists were speaking in hushed tones, their eyes darting between her and the receding horizon where the incident had occurred. "Did you see it?" Josh was asking his sister Emily, his earlier excitement replaced by a mix of fear and awe. "The shark, I mean." Emily shook her head, her face pale. "No, but I heard the splash." And Sophie's scream. She shuddered, unable to finish the sentence. Mike, overhearing the teenagers, moved to sit near them. "Hey, let's not dwell on it, okay? Sophie's safe, and that's what matters." Sophie appreciated Mike's attempt to calm the situation, but his words couldn't erase the image seared into her mind. The shark's sleek form cutting through the water, its black eyes fixed on her. The flash of teeth as its mouth opened. A fresh wave of panic washed over her. Sophie's breathing became rapid and shallow, her vision tunneling. She was back in the water, feeling the rough brush of the shark's skin against her leg. Sophie? Sophie? Zoe's sharp voice cut through the flashback. The guide was crouched in front of her, hands on Sophie's shoulders. Look at me. Focus on my voice. You're on the boat. You're safe. Sophie locked eyes with Zoe, forcing herself to take deep, shuddering breaths. Slowly, the panic receded, leaving her feeling drained and slightly nauseous. That's it, Zoe encouraged. Just keep breathing. Just keep. In through your nose, out through your mouth. As Sophie calmed, she became aware of a dull throbbing in her leg. She glanced down, noticing that blood had seeped through the bandage. Zoe followed her gaze. We'll need to change that dressing when we get back. The cuts aren't deep, but shark bites can be prone to infection. We'll make sure you get proper treatment. The word treatment triggered a new worry in Sophie's mind. Mon Dieu, she gasped. My travel insurance. Will it cover this? Linda patted her hand reassuringly. Don't you worry about that now, dear. We'll sort all that out later. As the boat neared the marina, Sophie could see a small crowd gathered on the dock. The flashing lights of an ambulance were visible in the parking lot beyond. Captain Steve's voice crackled over the boat's speakers. Folks, when we dock, please remain seated until the paramedics have attended to Ms. Dubois. Your cooperation is appreciated. Sophie felt a flush of embarrassment. All this fuss over her. C'est pas nécessaire, she mumbled. It's not necessary. I can walk. Zoe shook her head firmly. Protocol, Sophie. We take shark encounters very seriously, even minor ones like this. Plus, you're in shock. It's better to let the professionals check you out. As the boat docked, 2 paramedics boarded quickly, making their way to Sophie. She submitted to their examination, answering their questions in a daze. Yes, she had been bitten. No, she hadn't lost consciousness. Yes, she was experiencing some pain. We're going to take you to the hospital for a thorough checkup and to properly clean those wounds, one of the paramedics explained as they helped her onto a stretcher. As they wheeled her off the boat, Sophie caught snippets of conversation from the crowd on the dock. Shark attack. Tourist bitten. Great Barrier Reef. She closed her eyes, wishing she could shut out the voices, the stares, the whole situation. This was not how her dream vacation was supposed to go. In the ambulance, as the paramedic cleaned and redressed her wounds, Sophie's mind wandered to the shark. What had it been thinking? Was it really hunting her? Or just curious? The memory of its black, emotionless eyes staring at her sent a shiver down her spine. At the hospital, Sophie was whisked into the emergency department. Doctors examined her wounds, took blood samples, and peppered her with questions. The clinical environment, so at odds with the natural beauty she'd experienced earlier that day, made the whole situation feel surreal. As a nurse hung an IV bag of antibiotics, a new face appeared at Sophie's bedside. The woman was tall and tan, with streaks of gray in her dark hair, and she wore a polo shirt with a logo Sophie didn't recognize. Ms. Dubois, I'm Dr. Elena Reeves from the Marine Biology Research Center. Do you feel up to answering a few questions about your encounter? Sophie nodded tiredly. Oui. Yes. But why? Dr. Reeves pulled up a chair. Every shark encounter provides valuable data that helps us understand their behavior and improve safety measures for swimmers and divers. Your experience, while traumatic for you, could help prevent future incidents. As Sophie recounted the event, Dr. Reeves listened intently, occasionally jotting notes. When Sophie described the shark's initial curious circling, followed by its more aggressive approach after she scraped her leg, the marine biologist nodded knowingly. Classic investigatory behavior followed by a stimulus response, Dr. Reeves mused. The shark was likely drawn by your distressed movements and then further excited by the scent of blood from your scrape. Sophie shuddered at the clinical description of what had been the most terrifying moment of her life. Noticing her discomfort, Dr. Reeves softened her tone. I know this must be difficult to relive, Ms. Dubois, but please understand shark attacks, especially fatal ones, are incredibly rare. What you experienced was more of an investigatory bite. If the shark had intended to prey on you, the outcome would have been very different. Though meant to be reassuring, the words sent a chill through Sophie. She imagined again those rows of sharp teeth, thinking how easily they could have torn into her. Will I be okay? Sophie asked. her voice small. Dr. Reeves smiled gently. Physically, yes. The wounds are superficial and should heal well with proper care. Emotionally, that may take more time. It's normal to experience anxiety or even symptoms of PTSD after an encounter like this. I'd strongly recommend speaking with a counselor. As Dr. Reeves stood to leave, a commotion at the emergency room entrance caught their attention. A group of reporters had somehow made it past the reception desk and were pushing toward Sophie's bed, cameras flashing. "Ms. Dubois, can you tell us about the shark attack? How big was the shark? Will this incident affect tourism on the Great Barrier Reef?" Sophie recoiled from the barrage of questions, overwhelmed. Dr. Reeves quickly stepped in, bodily blocking the reporter's access. "This patient has been through a traumatic experience and needs rest," she said firmly. "I suggest you direct your questions to the proper authorities." As security guards arrived to escort the reporters out, Sophie sank back into her pillow, suddenly exhausted. The events of the day crashed over her like a wave. The beauty of the reef, the terror of the shark encounter, the pain and shock that followed. It was all too much. A nurse appeared, adjusting Sophie's IV. "Try to get some rest, love. You've had quite a day." As the mild sedative began to take effect, Sophie's thoughts drifted. She saw again the vibrant colors of the coral, the graceful sea turtle, the shimmering schools of fish. But overshadowing it all was the sleek, powerful form of the shark, a reminder of the wild, untamed nature of the ocean. In her last moments of consciousness before drifting off to sleep, Sophie realized that her perception of the sea had been forever changed. The Great Barrier Reef, which she had dreamed of for so long, was not just a place of wonder and beauty. It was a complex ecosystem where life and death played out daily, where humans were merely visitors in a world they could never fully understand or control. As sleep claimed her, Sophie's mind conjured an image of the shark, no longer a terrifying predator, but a magnificent, misunderstood creature, gliding effortlessly through the deep blue. In that moment, despite her fear and pain, she felt a profound connection to the ocean and all its mysteries. The beeping of hospital monitors faded away, replaced by the gentle lapping of waves and the distant calls of seabirds. In her dreams, Sophie floated peacefully in crystal-clear waters, the shadow below now a comforting presence rather than a threat. She had faced her fears and survived, emerging with a deeper understanding of the delicate balance between humans and nature. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, dealing with the media, deciding whether to continue her vacation, facing the ocean again. But for now, Sophie rested, her sleep punctuated by vivid dreams of the underwater world she had glimpsed, a world of both beauty and danger, forever etched in her memory. Sophie's eyes snapped open, her heart racing. For a moment, she was disoriented by the sterile white walls and the rhythmic beeping of hospital monitors. Then the memories came flooding back. The reef, the shark, the panic. A nurse noticed she was awake and approached with a gentle smile. "Good morning, Ms. Dubois. How are you feeling?" Sophie attempted to sit up, wincing as pain shot through her bandaged leg. I'm not sure," she replied honestly, her voice hoarse. As the nurse checked her vitals, Sophie's mind drifted back to the water. The memory was vivid, almost too real. She could still feel the current, see the dark shape approaching. A knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. Dr. Reeves, the marine biologist from the previous night, entered the room. "Ms. Dubois, I hope you're feeling a bit better," Dr. Reeves said, pulling up a chair beside the bed. "I have some news that I think you should hear." Sophie tensed, bracing herself. "What is it?" Dr. Reeves leaned forward, her expression serious. "There's been another incident. Early this morning, a local surfer was attacked about a mile from where you encountered the shark." Sophie's breath caught in her throat. "Mon Dieu. Is he? He's alive, but in critical condition," Dr. Reeves replied grimly. "The attack was much more severe than yours. We believe it's the same shark." The room seemed to spin around Sophie. She gripped the bed sheets tightly, trying to steady herself. "I don't understand," she whispered. "You said shark attacks were rare." Dr. Reeves nodded. "They are. But occasionally, a shark can become what we call a rogue, exhibiting unusually aggressive behavior towards humans. It's rare, but it happens. As if on cue, the TV in Sophie's room flicked on, showing a news broadcast. The headline scrolled across the bottom of the screen. Second shark attack in 24 hours. Great Barrier Reef on high alert. Sophie watched in horror as shaky footage played, showing a bloodied surfboard being pulled from the water. The reporter's voice was grim. Authorities are urging all beachgoers to stay out of the water until further notice. Marine experts are mobilizing to locate and potentially remove the shark responsible for these attacks. Dr. Reeves stood, her face etched with concern. I need to join the response team. Ms. Dubois, please try to rest. And I know this is difficult, but if you remember any other details about your encounter, anything at all, please let us know. It could be crucial. As Dr. Reeves left, Sophie sank back into her pillows, overwhelmed. The attack replayed in her mind, but this time it wasn't just her own terror she felt. She imagined the surfer alone in the water, facing the same primal fear she had experienced. Hours passed in a blur of nurses' checks, pain medication, and fitful attempts at sleep. Sophie's phone buzzed constantly with messages from worried friends and family back in France. Having seen the news of the attacks, she responded mechanically, assuring them she was okay, even as she struggled to believe it herself. As evening approached, there was another knock at her door. To her surprise, it was Linda and Mike, the couple from the snorkeling trip. "Oh, honey," Linda exclaimed, rushing to Sophie's bedside. "We've been so worried about you." Mike nodded solemnly. "We saw the news about the second attack. It's all anyone can talk about in town." Sophie managed a weak smile, genuinely touched by their concern. "Thank you for coming. I don't know what to say about all this." Linda took Sophie's hand, squeezing it gently. "You don't have to say anything. We're just glad you're safe." As they talked, Sophie felt some of the tension she'd been carrying start to ease. Linda and Mike's presence grounded her, reminding her of the world beyond her hospital room and the terrifying memories that had been consuming her. Their conversation was interrupted by a commotion in the hallway. Raised voices could be heard growing louder as they approached Sophie's room. "You can't just barge in there. The patient needs rest." It was the voice of Sophie's nurse, sounding uncharacteristically flustered. "The public has a right to know. This is a matter of public safety," a man's voice replied, aggressive and insistent. Before anyone could react, the door burst open. A man with a camera and a woman clutching a microphone pushed their way in, followed by the frantic nurse. "Ms. Dubois, can you tell us about the shark that attacked you? Do you think authorities are doing enough to protect tourists?" The reporter fired questions rapidly, the camera light blinding in the dim hospital room. Sophie recoiled, overwhelmed by the sudden invasion. Linda stepped in front of her protectively, while Mike moved to block the camera. "Get out. Can't you see she's recovering?" Mike's voice was low and dangerous. Security guards appeared, quickly removing the intruders, but the damage was done. Sophie's heart was racing, her breathing shallow and quick. The beeping of the heart monitor accelerated, matching her panic. "Deep breaths, honey," Linda soothed, stroking Sophie's hair. "They're gone now. You're safe." As Sophie struggled to calm herself, a new figure appeared in the doorway. It was Zoe, the snorkel guide from the boat. "I heard what happened," Zoe said, her face a mix of concern and anger. "Those vultures have no respect. Are you okay, Sophie?" Sophie nodded weakly, still trying to steady her breathing. Zoe approached the bed, her expression softening. "I know this is probably the last thing you want to think about right now," Zoe began hesitantly, "but I thought you should know. They're organizing a hunt for the shark." Sophie's eyes widened. "A hunt?" Zoe nodded grimly. "After the second attack, the authorities decided it was too dangerous to leave it out there. They're sending boats out tonight." A conflicting wave of emotions washed over Sophie. Relief that the threat would be removed, but also a strange sense of sadness. Despite her terror, she couldn't forget the shark's sleek beauty, its power and grace in the water. "What will happen to it?" Sophie asked quietly. Zoe's expression was pained. "If they catch it, they'll kill it. They say it's the only way to be sure." The room fell silent, the gravity of the situation settling over everyone. Sophie closed her eyes, remembering the moment she first saw the shark. Before the fear, there had been awe, wonder, a recognition of something ancient and powerful. It was just being what it is, Sophie whispered, more to herself than anyone else. A predator, acting on instinct. Linda squeezed her hand. That may be true, honey, but it's also true that it's dangerous. Sometimes there are no good choices. As night fell, Sophie found herself alone again, her visitors having been ushered out by the nurses. She lay awake, staring at the ceiling, her mind a whirlwind of conflicting thoughts and emotions. In the distance, she could hear the faint sound of boat engines. The hunt had begun. Sophie's thoughts turned to the shark, somewhere out there in the dark water. Was it aware of the danger it was in? Did it remember her, the strange creature it had encountered in its domain? As exhaustion finally began to overtake her, Sophie's last conscious thought was of the ocean, not as the realm of terror she had experienced during the attack, but as a vast, mysterious world. A world where beauty and danger coexisted, where life and death played out in an endless cycle. In her dreams that night, Sophie found herself back in the water, but this time there was no fear. She swam freely, marveling at the underwater world around her. And when the shark appeared, sleek and powerful, she felt only a profound sense of respect and awe. As dawn broke, Sophie was awakened by a gentle hand on her shoulder. It was Dr. Reeves, looking exhausted but with a hint of relief in her eyes. "They found it," she said simply. Sophie sat up slowly, wincing at the pain in her leg. "And?" Dr. Reeves sighed heavily. "It's over. The shark has been dealt with." A complex mix of emotions washed over Sophie. Relief, yes, but also a deep sadness and something else she couldn't quite name. A sense of loss, perhaps. The loss of innocence, of the simple joy she had felt when she first entered the water. "What happens now?" Sophie asked quietly. Dr. Reeves managed a small smile. "Now, Ms. Dubois, you heal, both your body and your mind, and perhaps in time, you'll find a way to reconcile what happened, to see the beauty of the ocean again without forgetting its power." As Dr. Reeves left, Sophie turned to look out the window. In the distance, she could see the ocean, its surface glittering in the early morning light. Beautiful and terrible, familiar yet forever changed in her eyes. She thought of the shark, of its life and death, of the fragile balance between humans and nature. And she knew that while her physical wounds would heal, this experience had changed her forever. The ocean, once a source of pure joy and wonder, now held a complexity she was only beginning to understand. Sophie closed her eyes, listening to the faint sound of waves in the distance. Whatever came next, she knew one thing for certain: she would never look at the sea the same way again. The hospital room felt smaller with each passing hour. Sophie's leg throbbed, a constant reminder of her encounter with the shark. She stared out the window, watching as the sun climbed higher in the sky, casting a glittering path across the distant ocean. The beauty was still there, but now it seemed tainted, overshadowed by the memory of terror. A knock at the door pulled her from her reverie. Dr. Reeves entered, her face grave. "Ms. Dubois, how are you feeling this morning?" she asked, moving to check Sophie's vitals. Sophie managed a weak smile. "As well as can be expected, I suppose." "Any news about the surfer? The one who was attacked after me?" Dr. Reeves's expression tightened. "That's actually why I'm here. His condition has deteriorated. The doctors are doing everything they can, but..." Sophie's heart sank. "Mon Dieu. Is there anything I can do?" The marine biologist hesitated, then pulled up a chair beside Sophie's bed. "Actually, there might be. We're exploring every avenue to help him, and there's a possibility that your experience could provide valuable information." Sophie sat up straighter, wincing slightly at the movement. "Of course, anything. What do you need?" "We need to understand exactly what happened during your encounter," Dr. Reeves explained. "Every detail, no matter how small, could be crucial. The shark's behavior, the water conditions, anything you can remember." For a moment, Sophie felt a wave of panic at the thought of reliving the attack. But then she thought of the surfer, fighting for his life, and steeled herself. "D'accord," she nodded. "I'll do my best." Over the next hour, Sophie recounted every detail she could remember. The initial sighting of the shark, its curious circling, the moment it charged. Dr. Reeves listened intently, occasionally jotting notes or asking for clarification. "There's one thing I don't understand," Sophie said as she finished her account. "You said shark attacks are rare. Why did this one become so aggressive?" Dr. Reeves leaned back in her chair, her brow furrowed. "That's what we're trying to figure out. Shark behavior is complex, and there are many factors that could contribute to increased aggression. Changes in water temperature, unusual currents bringing new prey into the area, even human activities affecting their normal patterns." As they talked, a commotion in the hallway caught their attention. Raised voices and hurried footsteps approached Sophie's room. The door burst open, revealing a frantic-looking man in his early 30s. "Where is she? The French woman who survived?" he demanded, his eyes wild as they landed on Sophie. Dr. Reeves stood quickly, positioning herself between the man and Sophie's bed. "Sir, you can't be in here. This is a private room." "Please," the man interrupted, his voice breaking. "You don't understand. That's my brother out there, the one who was attacked. They say he might not make it." Sophie felt her heart constrict. "You're the surfer's brother?" The man nodded, tears welling in his eyes. "Jack, his name is Jack. I'm Tom. Please, I need to know what happened. How did you survive?" Dr. Reeves tried to intervene, but Sophie held up a hand. "It's okay," she said softly. "Let him stay." As Tom sank into a chair, his body shaking with barely contained emotion, Sophie began to recount her experience once more. She spoke of the initial fear, the panic that had nearly overwhelmed her, and the moment when instinct had taken over. "I kicked out," she explained, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know how, but somehow I connected with its nose. It was enough to startle it, to give me a chance to get away." Tom listened intently, hanging on every word. When Sophie finished, he leaned forward, his eyes pleading. "But how? How did you stay calm enough to fight back?" Sophie shook her head. "I wasn't calm. I was terrified. But somehow in that moment my body knew what to do, even if my mind didn't." As they talked, a nurse appeared in the doorway, her expression urgent. "Dr. Reeves, you're needed immediately. It's about the surfer, Jack." Tom jumped to his feet, his face pale. "What is it? What's happened?" The nurse hesitated, glancing between Tom and Dr. Reeves. "The doctors have stabilized him for now, but they've detected signs of infection. The antibiotics aren't working as well as they'd hoped." Dr. Reeves's expression turned grim. "Shark bites can introduce a variety of bacteria into the wound. Some strains are resistant to common antibiotics." "So what does that mean?" Tom demanded, his voice rising. "What are you going to do?" Dr. Reeves placed a calming hand on Tom's shoulder. "We're going to fight this with everything we've got. But we need more information. Tom, I need you to tell me everything you can about where Jack was surfing. Any details about the location, the conditions, anything unusual he might have mentioned." As Tom began to recount what he knew, Sophie found herself drifting back to her own experience. The memory of the shark's rough skin against her leg, the searing pain of its teeth. Suddenly something clicked. "Wait," she interrupted, her eyes wide. "The scrape. Before the shark bit me, I scraped my leg on the coral. Could that have, I don't know, attracted it somehow?" Dr. Reeves turned to her, a look of realization dawning on her face. "The blood from the scrape? It could have triggered the shark's predatory instincts. And if there was bacteria on the coral..." She trailed off, her mind clearly racing. "We need to get a sample from that coral formation. If we can identify the specific bacteria, it might help us target the infection more effectively." Tom looked between them, a glimmer of hope in his eyes. "So there's a chance we might be able to help Jack?" Dr. Reeves nodded, already pulling out her phone. "I'm going to assemble a team to go out to the site immediately. We don't have a moment to lose." As she stepped out to make calls, Tom turned to Sophie, his expression a mix of gratitude and desperation. "Thank you," he said softly, "for sharing your story, for helping, for surviving. It gives me hope for Jack." Sophie reached out, grasping Tom's hand. "Your brother is strong. He's fighting. Don't give up on him." The next few hours passed in a blur of activity. Sophie watched from her window as a research vessel departed, speeding towards the site of her encounter. Nurses came and went, checking her vitals and changing her dressings. All the while, her mind raced with thoughts of Jack, of the shark, of the delicate balance of life in the ocean. As evening fell, Dr. Reeves returned, looking exhausted but determined. "We've got the samples," she announced. "The lab is analyzing them now. With any luck, we'll have results by morning." Sophie nodded, feeling a mix of relief and anxiety. "And Jack? How is he?" Dr. Reeves's expression softened. "Holding on. The doctors are doing everything they can to keep him stable until we can target the infection more effectively." As night descended, Sophie found sleep elusive. She tossed and turned, her dreams a chaotic mix of shimmering fish, gaping jaws, and Tom's anguished face. When she finally drifted off, she found herself back in the water, but this time, she wasn't alone. Jack was there, struggling against the current, his face pale and drawn. The shark circled them both, its dark eyes unreadable. Sophie reached out, trying to pull Jack to safety, but the water seemed to thicken around them, holding them in place. She awoke with a start, her heart pounding. The first light of dawn was just beginning to creep through her window. As she tried to calm her breathing, a commotion in the hallway caught her attention. Dr. Reeves burst into the room, her eyes bright with excitement. "We've got it! The lab identified the bacteria, and it's a strain we can target. They're preparing a specialized antibiotic cocktail for Jack right now." Sophie felt a wave of relief wash over her. "So he'll be okay?" "It's still touch and go," Dr. Reeves cautioned. "But this gives him a fighting chance. We wouldn't have known to look for this particular strain without your input about the coral scrape. You may well have saved his life, Sophie." As the news sank in, Sophie felt a complex mix of emotions wash over her. Relief, certainly, but also a profound sense of connection to Jack, to the ocean, to the intricate web of life that connected them all. Over the next few days, Sophie's recovery progressed steadily. Her physical wounds began to heal, the pain in her leg gradually subsiding. But it was the emotional healing that proved more challenging. Each time she closed her eyes, she saw the shark, felt the terror of those moments in the water. Tom visited daily, bringing updates on Jack's condition. The specialized antibiotics were working, slowly but surely fighting back the infection. With each positive report, Sophie felt a little of the weight lift from her shoulders. A week after the attack, Sophie stood at her window looking out at the ocean. The water sparkled in the sunlight, beautiful and serene. It was hard to reconcile this peaceful view with the danger she knew lurked beneath the surface. A knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. It was Dr. Reeves, accompanied by a tall, tanned man Sophie didn't recognize. "Sophie," Dr. Reeves began, her tone cautious. "This is Alex Thornton from the Marine Conservation Society. He'd like to speak with you if you're feeling up to it." Sophie nodded, curious despite her apprehension. Alex stepped forward, his expression earnest. "Ms. Dubois, first, let me say how sorry I am for what you've been through," he began. "But I'm here because your experience, tragic as it was, has provided us with invaluable data about shark behavior and the marine ecosystem." Sophie listened as Alex explained how the information gathered from her encounter and Jack's attack was helping researchers better understand the complex factors that influence shark behavior. The changes in water temperature due to climate change, the impact of overfishing on shark feeding patterns, the delicate balance of the reef ecosystem, all of these elements were interconnected, forming a picture that was only now becoming clear. "The truth is, Ms. Dubois," Alex concluded, "sharks are in far more danger from humans than we are from them. Overfishing, habitat destruction, climate change. These are the real threats, not just to sharks, but to the entire marine ecosystem." Sophie absorbed this information, feeling a shift in her perspective. The shark that had attacked her wasn't a mindless killer, but a creature acting on instinct, responding to changes in its environment. Changes largely brought about by human activity. "What can be done?" she asked, surprised by the strength in her own voice. Alex's eyes lit up at her question. "Education is key. People fear what they don't understand. If we can help people see sharks not as monsters, But as vital parts of a complex ecosystem, we can change attitudes and behaviors. As they talked, Sophie felt something stirring within her. The terror of the attack was still there, but alongside it now was something else. A sense of purpose, a desire to understand, to make meaning out of her experience. "I want to help," she said suddenly, surprising herself as much as Alex and Dr. Reeves. "I don't know how exactly, but I want to be part of this, to turn what happened into something positive." Alex smiled warmly. "That's wonderful, Sophie. Your story, your perspective. It could be incredibly powerful in helping people understand the importance of marine conservation." As they discussed possibilities, educational programs, awareness campaigns, even the potential for Sophie to train as a marine biology assistant, she felt a sense of excitement building. The attack had changed her, there was no denying that. But perhaps it had also opened a door to a new path, a new way of seeing the world and her place in it. Later that evening, as Sophie stood on her hospital room balcony, she looked out at the ocean with new eyes. The fear was still there, a respect for the power and unpredictability of nature. But alongside it now was a sense of wonder, a renewed appreciation for the complex, beautiful, sometimes dangerous world beneath the waves. The shark that had attacked her was gone, but its impact lingered, not just in the healing wounds on her leg, but in the way it had shifted her entire worldview. As she watched the sun sink towards the horizon, painting the sky and sea in brilliant hues of orange and pink, Sophie made a silent promise to herself and to the ocean. She would heal. She would learn. And somehow she would find a way to bridge the gap between the world of humans and the world beneath the waves, helping others to see the beauty, the complexity, and the vital importance of preserving our oceans. As night fell and the first stars began to twinkle in the darkening sky, Sophie felt a sense of peace settle over her. The journey ahead would not be easy, but for the first time since the attack she felt truly hopeful about the future. The race against time, to save Jack, to understand the shark, to protect the oceans, was ongoing. But now Sophie knew she had a part to play in that race, a purpose born from the very waters that had nearly claimed her life. The rhythmic beeping of medical monitors filled the air as Sophie was wheeled back into the emergency room. Her leg throbbed with a dull, persistent pain, and the coppery smell of blood hung in the air. The world around her seemed to move in slow motion, faces blurring as doctors and nurses rushed to her side. "Female, 30 years old, shark bite to the right calf." A paramedic rattled off to the waiting trauma team. "Significant blood loss, possible muscle damage. BP is 90/60 and dropping." Dr. Amelia Chen, the lead trauma surgeon, leaned over Sophie, her eyes sharp and focused behind her glasses. "Ms. Dubois, can you hear me? You're in the hospital now. We're going to take good care of you." Sophie managed a weak nod, her throat dry and her voice barely above a whisper. Yes, I understand." As the medical team worked to stabilize her, Sophie's mind drifted back to the water. The memory of the shark's rough skin against her leg, the searing pain of its teeth tearing into her flesh, was vivid and overwhelming. She squeezed her eyes shut, trying to block out the images, but they persisted, playing on an endless loop in her mind. "We need to get her to the OR now," Dr. Chen's voice cut through Sophie's haze of fear and pain. "Prep for emergency surgery. We need to assess the extent of the muscle damage and control this bleeding." As they wheeled her towards the operating room, Sophie caught snippets of urgent conversation around her. Possible femoral artery involvement. Risk of infection is high with marine bacteria. May need plastic surgery to... The words swirled around her, each one adding to the growing knot of fear in her stomach. As the anesthesiologist placed a mask over her face, Sophie's last conscious thought was of the ocean, beautiful and terrifying, a world she may never see the same way again. Hours later, Sophie slowly regained consciousness, the world coming into focus in bits and pieces. The first thing she became aware of was the pain, a deep, throbbing ache in her leg that seemed to pulse with each beat of her heart. Then came the sounds, the steady beep of heart monitors, the hushed voices of medical staff, the distant sound of a helicopter landing on the hospital's helipad. Ms. Dubois, you're awake." Dr. Chen's voice came from somewhere to her left. "How are you feeling?" Sophie turned her head, wincing at the movement. Like I've been chewed up and spit out, she managed, her voice hoarse. Dr. Chen nodded sympathetically. That's to be expected. The surgery went well, all things considered. We were able to repair the muscle damage and control the bleeding. However, there's still a significant risk of infection. Shark bites can introduce a lot of bacteria into the wound. As Dr. Chen explained the details of her condition and the road to recovery ahead, Sophie's mind drifted. She thought of her family back in France, of the panic they must be feeling right now. She thought of the beautiful reef she had been exploring just hours ago, now forever tainted by this traumatic experience. A commotion in the hallway interrupted Dr. Chen's explanation. Raised voices could be heard, growing louder as they approached Sophie's room. "Sir, you can't go in there. The patient needs rest." It was the voice of a nurse, sounding flustered and frustrated. "I need to see her. You don't understand, this is crucial." The man's voice was unfamiliar to Sophie, urgent and insistent. Before anyone could react, the door burst open. A man in his late 40s with salt and pepper hair and a weathered face pushed his way into the room. His eyes locked onto Sophie, a mix of relief and determination in his gaze. "Ms. Dubois," he said, slightly out of breath. "I'm Dr. Marcus Harding, marine biologist. I need to talk to you about the shark that attacked you." Dr. Chen stepped between them, her posture protective. "This is highly inappropriate. Ms. Dubois has just come out of surgery. She needs rest, not an interrogation." Dr. Harding held up his hands placatingly. "I understand, and I'm sorry for the intrusion. But this is a matter of life and death, not just for Ms. Dubois, but for others as well." Sophie struggled to sit up, curiosity overriding her exhaustion. "What do you mean?" Dr. Harding approached the bed, his expression grave. "There's been another attack. A surfer about an hour ago. He's in critical condition." A chill ran down Sophie's spine. "The same shark?" "We believe so." Dr. Harding nodded. "And that's why I need your help. We need to understand exactly what happened during your encounter. Every detail could be crucial in preventing more attacks and potentially saving lives." For a moment, Sophie hesitated. The thought of reliving the attack, of diving back into those terrifying memories, made her heart race. But then she thought of the surfer, fighting for his life, and of others who might be at risk. "Decord," she said softly. "I'll tell you everything I can remember." Over the next hour, Sophie recounted every detail of her encounter with the shark. Dr. Harding listened intently, occasionally asking for clarification or jotting down notes. As she spoke, Sophie found herself reliving the attack. The initial shock of seeing the shark, the paralyzing fear as it circled her, the searing pain of its bite. "There's one thing I don't understand," Sophie said as she finished her account. "You're a marine biologist. Shouldn't you be more concerned with protecting the shark than hunting it?" Dr. Harding's expression was pained. "Believe me, Ms. Dubois, this goes against everything I've worked for. Sharks are crucial to the marine ecosystem. They're not the mindless killers people often think they are. But in rare cases like this, when a shark exhibits unusually aggressive behavior towards humans, we have to consider the safety of the public." As they talked, a nurse entered the room, her face pale. "Dr. Chen, you're needed urgently. It's the surfer. His condition is deteriorating rapidly." Dr. Chen rushed out, leaving Sophie and Dr. Harding in a heavy silence. After a moment, Sophie spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "What will happen to the shark if you find it?" Dr. Harding sighed heavily. "In all likelihood, it will be killed. It's not a decision we make lightly, but in cases like this, it's often seen as the only way to ensure public safety." Sophie felt a conflicting wave of emotions wash over her. Relief that the threat would be removed, but also a strange sense of sadness. Despite her terror, she couldn't forget the shark's sleek beauty, its power and grace in the water. "It was just being what it is," Sophie said softly. "A predator, acting on instinct." Dr. Harding nodded, a glimmer of approval in his eyes. "That's a remarkably understanding perspective given what you've been through. You're right, of course. The shark isn't evil or malicious. It's a wild animal, acting on instincts honed over millions of years of evolution." Their conversation was interrupted by the return of Dr. Chen, her face grave. "The surfer, we lost him. His injuries were too severe. The news hit Sophie like a physical blow. She thought of the man she had never met, of the life cut short, of the family left to grieve. And she thought of the shark, still out there in the water, unaware of the hunt that was surely now beginning. Dr. Harding stood abruptly. "I need to go. They'll be organizing search parties, and I need to make sure this is handled as ethically as possible." As he turned to leave, Sophie called out, "Dr. Harding, please, if there's any way to do this without killing the shark." He paused at the door, his expression softening. "I'll do what I can, Ms. Dubois, but I can't make any promises." As night fell, Sophie found herself alone in her hospital room, her mind a whirlwind of conflicting thoughts and emotions. The pain in her leg had subsided to a dull throb, thanks to the morphine drip. But the emotional turmoil was harder to numb. She thought of the shark, somewhere out there in the dark water. Was it aware of the danger it was in? Did it remember her, the strange creature it had encountered in its domain? And what of the ecosystem it was a part of? What ripple effects would its removal have? A soft knock at the door pulled her from her thoughts. It was Linda, the woman from the snorkeling trip. Her face was etched with concern as she approached Sophie's bed. "Oh, honey," Linda said softly, taking Sophie's hand. "How are you holding up?" Sophie managed a weak smile. "As well as can be expected, I suppose. It's also overwhelming." Linda nodded sympathetically. "I can't even imagine. We've all been so worried about you. The whole town is talking about what happened." As they talked, Sophie found herself opening up about her conflicted feelings, her fear and pain, but also her concern for the shark and the broader implications of the incident. "I know it sounds crazy," Sophie said, her voice trembling slightly. "After what it did to me, I should hate it. But I can't help thinking about the bigger picture, about the role sharks play in the ocean, about the damage we humans do to their habitat." Linda squeezed her hand gently. "It doesn't sound crazy at all. It sounds like you have a big heart and a lot of empathy. That's a rare and beautiful thing, especially after going through something so traumatic." Their conversation was interrupted by a commotion outside. The sound of boat engines could be heard in the distance, growing louder. "The hunt," Sophie whispered, a knot forming in her stomach. "They're going after the shark." Linda moved to the window, peering out into the darkness. "There are a lot of boats out there. Looks like the whole town is turned out." As they watched the boat's lights moving across the water, Sophie felt a surge of determination. She couldn't just lie here while this was happening. She needed to do something to make her voice heard. "Linda," she said, her voice stronger than it had been all day. "I need your help. Can you find Dr. Harding for me? And maybe see if there's a way I can speak to the people leading this hunt?" Linda looked uncertain. "Are you sure that's a good idea? You need to rest." "Please," Sophie insisted. "I can't just do nothing. I need to at least try to make them understand." As Linda left to find Dr. Harding, Sophie steeled herself for what was to come. She knew the odds were against her. A single voice against a tide of fear and retribution. But she had to try. For the shark, for the ocean, and for herself. The next few hours were a blur of activity. Dr. Harding arrived, bringing with him local officials and representatives from the fisheries department. Sophie spoke passionately about the importance of sharks to the marine ecosystem, about the need for education rather than extermination, about finding a balance between human safety and conservation. To her surprise, people listened. Her unique perspective as both victim and advocate carried weight. While the hunt wasn't called off entirely, it was scaled back. Instead of a kill order, efforts were redirected towards capturing the shark for study and potential relocation. As dawn broke, casting a pale light over the ocean, Sophie felt a mix of exhaustion and cautious hope. She had done what she could. Now all she could do was wait and hope that her words had made a difference. Dr. Harding entered her room, looking tired but with a hint of a smile on his face. "Ms. Dubois, I thought you'd want to know. They've found the shark." Sophie's heart leaped. "And?" "Thanks in large part to your advocacy, they're attempting a live capture. If successful, the shark will be tagged and relocated to a less populated area." Relief washed over Sophie. It wasn't a perfect solution, but it was a step in the right direction. a balance between human safety and respect for marine life. As she lay back in her hospital bed, Sophie's gaze drifted to the window, to the ocean beyond. The water sparkled in the morning light, beautiful and mysterious as ever. She knew her relationship with the sea had been forever changed by this experience. The fear and trauma would take time to heal. But alongside that fear, there was something else now. A deepened respect for the ocean and its inhabitants, a desire to understand, to protect, to find a way for humans and marine life to coexist. Sophie closed her eyes, listening to the distant sound of waves. Her journey of recovery, both physical and emotional, was just beginning. But for the first time since the attack, she felt a glimmer of hope. Hope for herself, for the shark, and for the delicate balance of life in the great blue world beneath the waves. The rhythmic beeping of medical monitors filled the air as Sophie drifted in and out of consciousness. The stark white ceiling of the hospital room blurred and sharpened with each blink of her heavy eyelids. The pain in her leg, a constant reminder of her encounter with the shark, throbbed in time with her heartbeat. Dr. Chen's face swam into view, her brow furrowed with concern. "Sophie, can you hear me? I need you to stay with us." Sophie tried to respond, but her tongue felt thick and unwieldy in her mouth. She managed a weak nod, fighting against the fog of pain medication and exhaustion. "Good," Dr. Chen said, her voice firm but kind. "We're prepping you for another surgery. The infection in your leg is spreading faster than we anticipated. We need to act now to save the limb." The words pierced through Sophie's haze, sending a jolt of fear through her body. Save the limb? Was it really that serious? As if reading her thoughts, Dr. Chen squeezed her hand. "I know it sounds scary, but we're going to do everything we can. You're strong, Sophie. You've already survived so much." The next few hours passed in a blur of activity. Sophie was wheeled into the operating room, the harsh lights overhead making her squint. The anesthesiologist's voice was soothing as he explained the procedure, but Sophie could barely focus on the words. Her mind was a whirlwind of fear and fragmented memories. The glint of the shark's eye, the searing pain of its bite, the taste of salt water as she fought for her life. As the anesthesia began to take hold, Sophie's last conscious thought was of the ocean. Despite everything, she couldn't hate it. The power, the beauty, the sheer alien nature of it all. It was a world unto itself, indifferent to human concerns. As darkness claimed her, she wondered if she would ever see it again. Hours later, Sophie slowly clawed her way back to consciousness. The first thing she became aware of was the pain, duller now but still present, a constant reminder of her ordeal. Then came the sounds. The steady beep of monitors, the hushed voices of medical staff, the distant rumble of thunder from a storm brewing outside. She opened her eyes to find Dr. Chen standing over her, a cautious smile on her face. "Welcome back, Sophie. The surgery went well. We were able to remove the infected tissue and save your leg." Relief flooded through Sophie, followed quickly by a wave of exhaustion. She tried to speak, but her throat was dry and raw from the intubation tube. Dr. Chen offered her a sip of water through a straw. "Rest now," the doctor said gently. "Your body has been through a tremendous ordeal. Sleep is the best thing for you right now." As Sophie drifted off again, her dreams were a chaotic mix of images, shimmering fish darting through coral reefs, the sleek form of the shark cutting through dark water, and strangely, the faces of her parents back in France, worry etched into their features. She was roused sometime later by voices in her room, one she recognized as Dr. Chen's, the other unfamiliar but insistent. "Need to speak with her as soon as possible. This is a matter of public safety." Sophie opened her eyes to see Dr. Chen squaring off against a man in a crisp suit, his face set in hard lines. "Detective Hawkins, I understand your concerns," Dr. Chen was saying, her voice low but firm. "But Ms. Dubois has just come out of major surgery. She needs rest, not an interrogation." The man, Detective Hawkins, opened his mouth to argue further, but Sophie cut him off. "It's okay," she said, her voice weak but determined. "I can talk." Both Dr. Chen and the detective turned to her, surprise evident on their faces. "Sophie, you don't have to do this now," Dr. Chen said, moving to her bedside. "You need to rest." Sophie shook her head slightly. No, I want to. If it can help, if it can prevent anyone else from going through this. She trailed off, the effort of speaking leaving her breathless. Detective Hawkins approached the bed, his expression softening slightly. Ms. Dubois, I'm Detective Michael Hawkins. I'm investigating the shark attacks. I know this is difficult, but anything you can tell us about your experience could be crucial in preventing further incidents. Over the next hour, Sophie recounted her encounter with the shark in as much detail as she could muster. She described the initial sighting, the terror of realizing she had drifted too far from the group, the heart-stopping moment when the shark changed course and headed straight for her. As she spoke, the memories became vivid once again. The coldness of the water, the burning in her lungs as she fought to stay afloat, the searing pain as the shark's teeth tore into her leg. Detective Hawkins listened intently, occasionally asking for clarification but mostly allowing Sophie to tell her story uninterrupted. When she finished, exhaustion washing over her once again, he nodded solemnly. Thank you, Ms. Dubois. Your account will be invaluable in our investigation and in developing better safety protocols for the future. As the detective turned to leave, Sophie called out, her voice barely above a whisper. What will happen to the shark? Hawkins paused at the door, his expression unreadable. That's still being determined, but I can assure you we're taking every measure to ensure the safety of both humans and marine life. After he left, Dr. Chen checked Sophie's vitals, her face creased with concern. You should rest now. That was a lot to relive. But sleep eluded Sophie. Her mind was racing, replaying the attack over and over, but also grappling with larger questions. What right did humans have to punish a creature for following its instincts? How could the beauty and danger of the ocean be balanced? And how could she ever feel safe in the water again? Her thoughts were interrupted by a soft knock at the door. To her surprise, it was Zoe, the snorkel guide from the ill-fated trip. Hey, Zoe said softly, hovering uncertainly in the doorway. I hope it's okay that I'm here. I needed to see how you were doing. Sophie managed a weak smile. It's good to see you, Zoe. Please come in. Zoe approached the bed, her eyes taking in the various tubes and monitors attached to Sophie. God, Sophie, I'm so sorry. I should have been watching more closely. I should have… Non. Sophie interrupted, shaking her head. It wasn't your fault. These things, they happen. Nature is unpredictable. Zoe sank into the chair beside the bed, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. I've been a guide for 5 years. Nothing like this has ever happened before. I keep replaying it in my mind, wondering if I could have done something differently. Sophie reached out, wincing slightly at the movement, and grasped Zoe's hand. You did everything you could. You got me out of the water. You saved my life. They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of shared experience hanging between them. Finally, Zoe spoke again, her voice barely above a whisper. They're talking about culling the sharks in the area, setting up nets, increasing patrols. Some people are even calling for a complete shutdown of water activities. Sophie felt a pang in her chest that had nothing to do with her physical injuries. But that's not right. The shark was just being a shark. We're the ones invading their territory. Zoe nodded, a hint of a smile crossing her face. That's what I've been trying to tell people. But after what happened to you, and then the surfer, people are scared. And scared people don't always think rationally. As they talked, Sophie felt something shifting inside her. The fear was still there, a cold knot in the pit of her stomach. But alongside it was something else. A determination, a sense of purpose. We have to do something, she said, her voice stronger than it had been in days. We can't let fear dictate our actions. There has to be a way to coexist, to respect the ocean and its inhabitants while still enjoying its beauty. Zoe looked at her with a mix of surprise and admiration. You're incredible, you know that? After everything you've been through, you're still thinking about the bigger picture. Sophie shrugged slightly, wincing at the movement. Maybe it's because of what I've been through. I've seen the power of the ocean up close. It's terrifying, yes, but also awe-inspiring. We can't just shut ourselves off from that world because of fear. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Dr. Chen, come to check on Sophie's condition. As Zoe left, promising to return soon, Sophie found herself filled with a new sense of purpose. She may be confined to this hospital bed for now, but her mind was active, already formulating plans. Over the next few days, Sophie's room became a hub of activity. Despite Dr. Chen's concerns about her need for rest, Sophie insisted on meeting with marine biologists, conservationists, and local officials. She shared her story tirelessly, not just the terror of the attack, but also the beauty she had witnessed in the reef, the importance of preserving these delicate ecosystems. Her parents arrived from France, their faces etched with worry that slowly gave way to pride as they saw their daughter's determination. Sophie's father, a journalist, helped her craft her message, while her mother used her connections in the fashion industry to start a social media campaign, raising awareness about ocean conservation. A week after the surgery, Dr. Chen entered Sophie's room with a cautious smile. "Your latest test results are promising. The infection is under control, and the wound is healing well. If this progress continues, we might be able to start talking about rehabilitation soon." Sophie nodded, grateful for the good news, but her mind already racing ahead. "Dr. Chen, I've been thinking. Once I'm recovered, I want to do more. To educate people about sharks, about the ocean, to help find a balance between human safety and marine conservation." Dr. Chen's smile widened. "I had a feeling you might say something like that. As it happens, I have someone here who might be able to help with that." She stepped aside to reveal Dr. Marcus Harding, the marine biologist who had interviewed Sophie after the attack. He entered the room, a look of admiration on his face. "Ms. Dubois," he said warmly, "I've been following your advocacy work from your hospital bed. It's truly remarkable. I have a proposal for you if you're interested." As Dr. Harding outlined his idea, a documentary series exploring the relationship between humans and the ocean, with Sophie as a central figure, she felt a surge of excitement. This was it. This was how she could turn her traumatic experience into something positive, something that could make a real difference. Looking out the window at the distant shimmer of the ocean, Sophie felt a complex mix of emotions. The fear was still there, a reminder of the power and unpredictability of nature, but alongside it now was something else, a sense of purpose, a connection to something larger than herself. She had entered the water as a tourist, naive to the complexities of the marine world. She had emerged a survivor, yes, but also an advocate, a voice for those creatures who could not speak for themselves. The road ahead would be challenging, physically, emotionally, and practically. But as she looked at the faces of those gathered in her room, Dr. Chen, Dr. Harding, her parents, Zoe, Sophie knew she wouldn't be facing those challenges alone. The shark had changed her life in ways she never could have imagined. Now, it was up to her to ensure that change rippled out into the world, creating waves of understanding, respect, and conservation for the great blue world that covered so much of our planet. As she began to discuss the details of the documentary with Dr. Harding, Sophie felt, for the first time since the attack, truly alive. The fight for her life had become a fight for something much larger, and she was ready for the challenge. The coastal town of Cairns was abuzz with activity as the morning sun climbed higher in the sky. The usually tranquil tourist destination had been transformed into a hub of media frenzy and scientific inquiry in the wake of the recent shark attacks. News vans lined the streets near the hospital, their satellite dishes reaching towards the cloudless blue sky like metal sunflowers. Inside the hospital, Sophie Dubois sat on the edge of her bed, her fingers tracing the outline of the bandages on her leg. It had been 2 weeks since the attack, and today marked a significant milestone in her recovery, her first attempt at physical therapy. A soft knock at the door drew her attention. Dr. Chen entered, followed by a tall, athletic woman with short, cropped hair. "Good morning, Sophie," Dr. Chen said with a warm smile. "How are you feeling today?" Sophie managed a small smile in return. "Nervous, but ready." Dr. Chen nodded understandingly. "That's perfectly normal. I'd like you to meet Sarah Thompson. She'll be your physical therapist." Sarah stepped forward, extending her hand. "It's nice to meet you, Sophie. I've heard a lot about you." Sophie shook her hand, noting the firm grip and calloused palm. "All good things, I hope?" Sarah grinned. "Oh, absolutely. They tell me you're quite the fighter. As Sarah began to explain the rehabilitation process, Sophie found her gaze drawn to the window. From her room on the 4th floor, she had a clear view of the ocean. The water sparkled invitingly in the morning sun, belying the danger that lurked beneath its surface. "Sophie?" Sarah's voice brought her attention back to the room. "Are you ready to give it a try?" Taking a deep breath, Sophie nodded. "As ready as I'll ever be." With Sarah's help, Sophie eased herself into a standing position. Pain shot through her leg, causing her to grimace. "That's normal," Sarah assured her. "We're going to take this nice and slow. Just focus on shifting your weight for now." As Sophie took her first tentative steps, leaning heavily on a walker, she couldn't help but feel a mix of frustration and determination. She had always been active, priding herself on her strength and agility. Now, simply walking across the room felt like scaling a mountain. "You're doing great," Sarah encouraged. "Remember, this is just the beginning. It's going to take time, but you'll get there." After what felt like hours but was probably only about 20 minutes, Sophie was back in bed, exhausted, but with a sense of accomplishment. "You should be proud of yourself," Dr. Chen said, making some notes in Sophie's chart. "You've made excellent progress already." As Dr. Chen and Sarah left the room, promising to return later for another session, Sophie was left alone with her thoughts. The physical therapy had been challenging, yes, but it was the emotional and psychological recovery that truly daunted her. Her musings were interrupted by another knock at the door. This time it was a familiar face. Dr. Marcus Harding, the marine biologist she had met shortly after the attack. "Ms. Dubois," he greeted her with a warm smile. "I hope I'm not interrupting?" Sophie shook her head. "Not at all. Please come in." Dr. Harding settled into the chair beside her bed, his expression turning serious. "I wanted to update you on the situation. The media attention surrounding your attack and the subsequent incident with the surfer has intensified the debate about shark conservation and public safety." Sophie leaned forward, wincing slightly at the movement. "What's being done?" "Well, that's why I'm here," Dr. Harding replied. "Your story has resonated with a lot of people. The way you've advocated for understanding and conservation, even after what you've been through. It's powerful. We think your voice could make a real difference in shaping public opinion and policy." Sophie's heart raced with a mix of excitement and apprehension. "What did you have in mind?" Dr. Harding's eyes lit up. "We're putting together a documentary series about human-shark interactions and marine conservation. We'd like you to be a part of it. Your journey, from attack victim to advocate, could be the narrative thread that ties it all together." Sophie sat back, her mind whirling with possibilities. It was an opportunity to turn her traumatic experience into something positive, to make a real difference. But it would also mean reliving the attack, exposing herself to public scrutiny, and potentially facing her fears head-on. I need some time to think about it," she said finally. Dr. Harding nodded understandingly. "Of course, it's a big decision. But I want you to know we're not looking to sensationalize what happened to you. This is about education, about fostering understanding and respect for these incredible creatures and the ecosystems they inhabit." As Dr. Harding left, promising to return in a few days for her decision, Sophie found herself once again staring out at the ocean. The water seemed to call to her, both enticing and terrifying. Could she really face that world again? Her contemplation was interrupted by the arrival of an unexpected visitor. Tom, the brother of Jack, the surfer who had been attacked after her. "I hope I'm not intruding," Tom said, hovering uncertainly in the doorway. Sophie gestured for him to enter. "Not at all. Please, come in. How are you doing?" Tom sank into the chair, his face etched with grief and exhaustion. "It's been hard. The funeral was yesterday." Sophie felt a pang of guilt. She had been so focused on her own recovery she hadn't even known about Jack's funeral. "I'm so sorry, Tom. I wish I could have been there." Tom shook his head. No, you're recovering." Jack would have understood. He paused, seeming to gather his thoughts. "Actually, that's part of why I'm here. I heard about the documentary project Dr. Harding is proposing." Sophie nodded, unsure where this was going. "I want you to do it," Tom said, his voice growing stronger. "Jack, he loved the ocean. He respected it, understood its power and its beauty. He wouldn't want his death to fuel fear and hatred towards sharks. He'd want people to understand, to learn. Tears welled up in Sophie's eyes. "Tom, I don't know what to say." Tom reached out, grasping her hand. "You don't have to say anything. Just think about it. You have a chance to make something good come out of all this tragedy." Jack would have wanted that. As Tom left, Sophie felt a shift inside her. The fear and doubt that had been plaguing her began to give way to a sense of purpose. She reached for her phone, scrolling through her contacts, until she found Dr. Harding's number. "Dr. Harding? It's Sophie Dubois. I've made my decision. I want to do the documentary." The next few weeks passed in a whirlwind of activity. Between intensive physical therapy sessions and meetings with Dr. Harding and his production team, Sophie barely had a moment to catch her breath. But for the first time since the attack, she felt truly alive, driven by a sense of purpose. Her recovery progressed steadily. Under Sarah's guidance, Sophie graduated from the walker to crutches and finally to a cane. Each step was a victory, a reclamation of her independence. As her strength returned, so did her determination to face her fears. It was during one of her therapy sessions with Sarah that Sophie made a decision that would change the course of her recovery. "I want to go back in the water," she announced, her voice steady despite the fear fluttering in her stomach. Sarah paused in her manipulation of Sophie's leg, looking up with surprise. "Are you sure?" "There's no rush, Sophie. It's okay to take your time." Sophie nodded firmly. "I'm sure. If I'm going to do this documentary, if I'm going to be an advocate for understanding and conservation, I need to face this head on. I can't speak about respecting the ocean if I'm too afraid to even dip my toes in it." Sarah studied her for a moment, then nodded. "All right. But we do this carefully, step by step, and I'll be with you every step of the way." The next morning found Sophie standing on the beach, the soft sand cool beneath her bare feet. The ocean stretched out before her, a vast expanse of blue that seemed to go on forever. Dr. Harding stood nearby with a small camera crew, ready to document this crucial moment in Sophie's journey. Sarah stood beside her, a supportive hand on her shoulder. "Remember, we're just going to walk to the water's edge today. You don't have to go in if you're not ready." Sophie took a deep breath, inhaling the salty air. "No, I need to do this. I'm ready." With Sarah at her side, Sophie began to walk towards the water. Each step sent a jolt of pain through her healing leg, but she pushed through it, her eyes fixed on the gently lapping waves ahead. As they neared the water's edge, Sophie felt her heart begin to race. Memories of the attack flashed through her mind. The initial shock of seeing the shark, the searing pain of its bite, the desperate struggle to survive. She paused at the very edge of the surf, the cool water lapping at her toes. For a moment she stood frozen, her body trembling slightly. "It's okay," Sarah said softly. "We can stop here. You've already come so far." But Sophie shook her head. With a determined set to her jaw, she took another step forward, then another. The water rose to her ankles, then her calves. She winced as the salt water stung her healing wounds, but she didn't stop. When the water reached her waist, Sophie finally paused. She stood there, feeling the gentle push and pull of the waves, the sun warm on her face. And slowly, something began to change inside her. The fear was still there, a cold knot in the pit of her stomach. But alongside it now was something else, a sense of awe, of connection to something vast and powerful and beautiful. "I did it," she whispered, tears mingling with the salt water on her cheeks. Sarah squeezed her shoulder. "You did. And this is just the beginning." As they made their way back to shore, Sophie noticed Dr. Harding approaching, his face beaming with pride and excitement. "Sophie, that was incredible," he said. "How do you feel?" Sophie thought for a moment, trying to put the complex swirl of emotions into words. "Scared," she admitted, "but also alive. More alive than I've felt since the attack." Dr. Harding nodded understandingly. "That's the power of the ocean. It can terrify us, yes, but it can also heal us, inspire us. That's what we want to capture in the documentary." Over the next few months, Sophie threw herself into the project with everything she had. She worked closely with Dr. Harding and his team, sharing her story and learning more about marine ecosystems and shark behavior than she ever thought possible. The documentary took them to various locations along the Great Barrier Reef. Sophie swam with harmless reef sharks, marveling at their grace and beauty. She interviewed other shark attack survivors, some who had become advocates like her, others who still struggled with the trauma. One particularly memorable day found Sophie on a research vessel with Dr. Harding and his team. They were tracking a great white shark that had been tagged as part of a long-term study on migration patterns. As Sophie watched the dorsal fin break the surface some distance from the boat, she felt a complex mix of emotions. Fear, yes, but also respect, and a strange sense of kinship. "It's beautiful, isn't it?" Dr. Harding said, coming to stand beside her at the railing. Sophie nodded. "It is. I never thought I'd be able to say that about a shark again, but it's true. They're incredible creatures." Dr. Harding smiled. "That's what we're hoping people will take away from this documentary. Sharks aren't mindless killing machines. They're a vital part of the ocean ecosystem, and they deserve our respect and protection." As the sun began to set, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and pink, Sophie found herself reflecting on how far she'd come. From the terrified victim in a hospital bed to standing on this boat, watching a shark with fascination rather than fear. It was a journey she never could have imagined. The documentary series titled Beyond the Bite, Rethinking Our Relationship with Sharks, was released to critical acclaim. Sophie's story, woven throughout the episodes, provided a powerful narrative thread that connected with viewers on an emotional level. The series sparked intense debate and discussion. While some still argued for more aggressive measures to protect swimmers and surfers, many were moved by the documentary's message of coexistence and conservation. On the night of the final episode's premiere, Sophie found herself standing at a podium, addressing a room full of marine biologists, conservationists, and policymakers. "When that shark attacked me," she began, her voice steady and clear, "I thought my life was over. And in a way, it was. The person I was before that day no longer exists. But what's emerged from that tragedy is something I never could have anticipated." She paused, looking out at the sea of faces before her. "I've learned that the ocean, with all its power and mystery, is not our enemy. The sharks that inhabit it are not villains in some horror story. They are ancient, incredible creatures that play a vital role in maintaining the health of our oceans. We, as humans, have a choice," she continued. "We can let fear drive us to destroy what we don't understand, or we can choose to learn, to respect, to coexist. It won't be easy. It will require us to rethink our relationship with the ocean, to approach it with humility and caution. But I believe it's a choice we must make, not just for the sake of the sharks or the oceans, but for ourselves." As applause filled the room, Sophie felt a sense of completion. The journey that had begun with terror and pain had led her here, to a place where she could use her voice to make a real difference. Later that night, as she stood on the balcony of her hotel room, looking out at the moonlit ocean, Sophie reflected on the strange turns her life had taken. The scars on her leg would always be a reminder of that terrifying day, but they no longer filled her with dread. Instead, they were a testament to her survival, to her strength, and to the incredible journey that had brought her here. As she listened to the gentle lapping of the waves against the shore, Sophie felt at peace. She had faced her fears, found her voice, and in doing so, had become part of something much larger than herself. The ocean stretched out before her, vast and mysterious as ever. But now, instead of fear, Sophie felt a sense of connection, of belonging. She was part of this world, this delicate balance of life and death, beauty and danger. And she was ready for whatever challenges the future might bring. As she turned to go back inside, Sophie cast one last look at the shimmering water. Somewhere out there, sharks were gliding through the depths, ancient and powerful, and thanks to her efforts and those of countless others, perhaps they would continue to do so for generations to come. The attack had changed her life in ways she never could have imagined, but in the end it had given her a purpose, a mission, and for that, despite everything, Sophie found herself feeling grateful. The early morning sun cast long shadows across the tarmac of Cairns Airport as Sophie Dubois wheeled her small suitcase towards the departures terminal. 6 months had passed since the shark attack that had nearly claimed her life and irrevocably altered its course. Now, as she prepared to board her flight back to France, Sophie found herself grappling with a complex swirl of emotions. She paused at the entrance, turning to take one last look at the distant shimmer of the ocean. The sight still sent a small shiver down her spine, but the paralyzing fear she had once felt had been replaced by something more nuanced, a mixture of respect, awe, and a lingering caution. "You ready for this?" Sophie turned to see Dr. Marcus Harding approaching, a gentle smile on his weathered face. The marine biologist had become a close friend and mentor over the past months as they worked together on the shark conservation documentary. Sophie took a deep breath, squaring her shoulders. "As ready as I'll ever be, I suppose." Dr. Harding nodded understandingly. "It's a big step going home. How are you feeling about it?" "Nervous," Sophie admitted. "Excited to see my family, of course, but I'm not the same person they saw off at the airport 6 months ago. I'm not sure they'll understand how much I've changed." "Change isn't always easy for those around us to accept," Dr. Harding said softly. "But give them time. Your passion, your new purpose, it's inspiring, Sophie. They'll see that." As they made their way through check-in and security, Sophie found her mind drifting back over the whirlwind of the past few months. The grueling physical therapy sessions, the emotional roller coaster of facing her fears, the countless hours spent filming and advocating for shark conservation. It had been challenging, often exhausting, but also deeply fulfilling. At the gate, Dr. Harding gave her a warm hug. "Safe travels, Sophie. Remember, you're not just going home, you're embarking on the next phase of your journey. The work we've started here, it doesn't end just because you're leaving Australia." Sophie nodded, blinking back unexpected tears. "I know. Thank you, Marcus, for everything." As she settled into her seat on the plane, Sophie pulled out her notebook. She had started journaling as part of her therapy, a way to process the trauma and track her recovery. Now, it had become a habit, a way to organize her thoughts and plan for the future. The flight attendant's voice came over the intercom, instructing passengers to prepare for takeoff. As the plane began to accelerate down the runway, Sophie looked out the window. The coastline receded, the vast expanse of the Pacific stretching out below. Somewhere down there, sharks were gliding through the depths, unaware of the impact they had had on her life. Sophie closed her eyes as the plane lifted off, leaving Australian soil behind. But in her mind, she was back in the water, reliving that fateful day. The memory was vivid, almost too real. The initial shock of cold as she entered the water, the vibrant colors of the reef, the mesmerizing dance of light filtering through the waves. Then, the heart-stopping moment when she first saw the shark. It had appeared almost out of nowhere, a sleek, powerful form gliding effortlessly through the water. In that first instant, before the fear set in, Sophie had been struck by its beauty, its perfect adaptation to its environment. Then came the terror as it turned towards her, its black eyes seeming to fix on her with predatory intent. The desperate struggle as she tried to swim away, her movements clumsy and panicked in comparison to the shark's fluid grace. The pain when it struck was beyond anything Sophie had ever experienced. It was not just the physical agony of teeth tearing into flesh, but a primal, existential fear. The realization that she was prey, that her life could end here in the depths of the ocean. But even in that moment of utmost terror, something unexpected had happened. As Sophie fought for her life, striking out at the shark in desperation, she had looked into its eye. And in that split second, she saw not a mindless killing machine, but a wild creature acting on instinct, as much a part of the ocean as the coral and the fish. That moment of connection, brief as it was, had stayed with Sophie throughout her recovery. It had been the seed from which her advocacy had grown, the reason she could speak about shark conservation with such passion and conviction. Sophie's eyes snapped open as the plane hit a pocket of turbulence. Her heart was racing, her palms sweaty. The memory of the attack still had the power to affect her physically, even after all this time. Taking deep, calming breaths, Sophie turned her attention back to her notebook. She had promised to give an interview to a French environmental magazine upon her return, and she wanted to be prepared. As she jotted down notes and talking points, Sophie reflected on how much her perspective had changed. Before the attack, she had given little thought to marine conservation. Sharks were just another creature in the sea, more myth than reality in her mind. Now she understood the vital role they played in ocean ecosystems. She had learned about the devastating impact of shark finning, of bycatch in commercial fishing operations, of habitat destruction. More importantly, she had learned about the complex and often misunderstood nature of shark behavior. Hours passed as Sophie worked on her notes, pausing occasionally to accept a drink from the flight attendant or stretch her healing leg in the confined space of the airplane seat. As the captain announced their approach to Paris, Sophie felt a flutter of nervousness in her stomach. How would her family react to this new version of herself? Would they understand her passion for a cause that had nearly cost her life? And how would she cope with being so far from the ocean that had become such a significant part of her life? As the plane touched down at Charles de Gaulle Airport, Sophie took a deep breath, steeling herself for what was to come. The familiar sights and sounds of her home country washed over her as she made her way through customs and baggage claim. And then, there they were, her parents standing anxiously at the arrival gate, their faces a mixture of joy and concern. Sophie felt a lump form in her throat as she walked towards them, suddenly acutely aware of her slight limp, the visible scars on her leg. "Sophie!" her mother cried, rushing forward to envelop her in a tight embrace. "Oh, ma chérie, we've been so worried." Her father joined the hug, his strong arms wrapping around both of them. For a moment, Sophie allowed herself to be engulfed in their love and concern, feeling like a little girl again rather than the woman who had faced death and come out stronger. As they pulled apart, Sophie saw her mother's eyes dart to her leg, widening slightly at the sight of the scars. "Oh, Sophie," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "It's okay, Maman," Sophie said softly. "I'm okay. These scars, they're part of me now. They remind me of what I've survived, what I've learned." Her father squeezed her shoulder, his eyes shining with unshed tears. "We're so proud of you, of ma petite. When we saw the documentary, Sophie, what you've done, it's incredible." As they made their way to the car, Sophie's parents peppered her with questions about her final weeks in Australia, her plans for the future, her ongoing recovery. Sophie answered as best she could, but she could sense an undercurrent of tension, of things left unsaid. It wasn't until they were in the car, Paris traffic crawling around them, that her mother finally broached the subject Sophie had been dreading. "Sophie, chérie," she began hesitantly, "this work you're doing with the sharks, are you sure it's wise? After what happened to you?" Sophie felt a flare of frustration, but she tamped it down. She had anticipated this reaction, had prepared for it. "Maman, I understand your concern, but what happened to me? It's precisely why this work is so important." She took a deep breath, organizing her thoughts. Sharks aren't the monsters we've made them out to be. They're a crucial part of the ocean ecosystem. What happened to me was tragic, yes, but it was also incredibly rare. More people are killed each year by vending machines than by sharks. Her father chuckled softly at that, earning a sharp look from her mother. "The real tragedy," Sophie continued, her voice growing passionate, "is what we're doing to their populations. Millions of sharks are killed each year for their fins, or as bycatch in commercial fishing operations. If we don't act now, we could lose these incredible animals forever, and that would be a disaster for the entire ocean ecosystem." As she spoke, Sophie could see her parents exchanging glances in the rearview mirror. There was concern there, yes, but also a growing understanding, perhaps even a hint of pride. "We just want you to be safe, Sophie," her father said softly. "When we got that call, telling us you'd been attacked, it was the worst moment of our lives." Sophie reached forward, squeezing her father's shoulder. "I know, Papa, and I promise you I'm not taking unnecessary risks. But this is important. It's become my purpose. Can you understand that?" There was a moment of silence, broken only by the soft hum of the car's engine and the distant honking of Parisian traffic. Then slowly, her mother nodded. "We may not fully understand it, ma chérie," she said, her voice thick with emotion, "but we can see how much it means to you. And we will support you, always. Relief washed over Sophie. She knew there would be more discussions, more explanations needed, but this was a start. Her parents were trying to understand, and that was all she could ask for. As they drove through the familiar streets of Paris, Sophie found her gaze drawn to the Seine. It was a far cry from the vast, wild expanse of the Pacific, but the sight of water still stirred something in her. She thought of the sharks swimming in distant oceans, of the work still to be done to protect them. And she knew with a certainty that ran bone deep that her journey was far from over. The next few days passed in a whirlwind of family gatherings, medical checkups, and media interviews. Sophie found herself constantly explaining her newfound passion, recounting her experience and advocating for shark conservation. It was exhausting but also exhilarating. A week after her return, Sophie stood before a full lecture hall at the Sorbonne, preparing to give a talk on marine conservation. As she looked out at the sea of faces, a mixture of students, academics, and members of the public, she felt a flutter of nervousness in her stomach. Taking a deep breath, Sophie began to speak. 6 months ago, I stood in the waters of the Great Barrier Reef, face to face with a shark. In that moment, I was certain my life was over. Instead, I discovered it was just beginning. As she spoke, sharing her experience and the knowledge she had gained, Sophie could see the audience becoming engaged. There were gasps of shock as she described the attack, nods of understanding as she explained the importance of sharks to marine ecosystems, and thoughtful frowns as she outlined the challenges facing shark populations worldwide. When she finished, the applause was thunderous. As people lined up to ask questions or share their own thoughts, Sophie felt a surge of hope. This was why she had survived, she realized. Not just to tell her story, but to be a voice for these misunderstood creatures, to bridge the gap between fear and understanding. Later that evening, as Sophie stood on the balcony of her parents' apartment, looking out over the city lights of Paris, her phone buzzed with a message. It was from Dr. Harding. Saw the video of your lecture, the message read. Incredible job, Sophie. You're making a real difference. How would you feel about joining us for a research expedition in South Africa next month? Great white shark population studies could be a powerful addition to our documentary series. Sophie felt a jolt of excitement, followed immediately by a flicker of fear. Great whites were the stuff of nightmares, the very image most people conjured when they thought of shark attacks. Could she face that? She closed her eyes, feeling the cool evening breeze on her face. In her mind, she was back in the waters of the Great Barrier Reef, feeling the primal fear as the shark approached. But now, that memory was layered with others. The thrill of watching sharks glide gracefully through the water, from the safety of a research vessel. The satisfaction of seeing understanding dawn in people's eyes as she spoke about conservation, the sense of purpose that had filled the void left by her trauma. Opening her eyes, Sophie looked out at the city sprawled before her. Paris was her home, would always be a part of her. But now the ocean called to her as well, not with the siren song of tropical beaches and carefree swims, but with the deep resonant call of purpose, of work yet to be done. Her fingers hovered over the phone for just a moment before she began to type her reply. I'm in, she wrote. When do we leave? As she hit send, Sophie felt a sense of peace settle over her. The scars on her leg would always be there, a permanent reminder of how close she had come to death. But they were no longer a source of fear or shame. They were a testament to her survival, to her strength, and to the incredible journey that had brought her to this moment. The ocean, with all its beauty and danger, had changed her life. Now it was her turn to try and change the way the world saw the ocean, one person at a time. Sophie took one last look at the Parisian skyline before turning to go back inside. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new fears to face, but she was ready. The girl who had stepped into the waters of the Great Barrier Reef 6 months ago was gone. In her place stood a woman who had faced her deepest fears and emerged stronger, a voice for the voiceless creatures of the deep, a bridge between two worlds. As she closed the balcony door behind her, Sophie smiled to herself. Her journey had only just begun, and she couldn't wait to see where it would take her next.